I do a provisional cast on, I usually have these materials in front of me. I have the needles that I need for my project. I like to have my favorite stitch markers handy, a crochet hook, and this is going to end up being waste yarn that we'll get rid of at the end. And typically I like to choose a color that is a pretty stark contrast to whatever I'm going to use in my project. So then at the end, when it's time to take the provisional cast on off and pick up the live stitches, it's easy to tell the difference between my project and the waste yarn. So we are going to start with the waste yarn and the hook. Okay, so I'm going to take my yarn and position it in my hand like I do when I knit. I hold the yarn the exact same way. There's nothing different about the way that I hold my yarn. I'm going to pinch the yarn with my middle finger and my thumb. I'm going to take my crochet hook, and what I'm going to do is create a twist around the crochet hook instead of making a slip knot. This is just my preferred method. You could just start with an easy slip knot. Both ways I think are just fine. So I'm going to start by getting the camera to focus. There we go. I'm going to put my hook on top of the yarn, swing the hook around the back, and then flip the hook upside down. I'll do that again. I'm going to lay my hook on top, swing my hook around the back, and flip around. We'll do it one more time. Lay my hook on top, swing the hook around the back, and now flip. So now I have this twist in my yarn. I'm going to use my fingers to pinch that twist, and I'm going to chain one and then tighten it down. So it's basically just another way to make a slip knot. I'm going to start my provisional cast on by chaining 5. 1, oops, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've now chained 5. At this point, I'm going to grab the needle that I want to use. I'm going to tension my yarn, and I'm going to hold the needle in between my hands. So I'm tensioning with the left hand, holding the crochet hook with my right hand, and the needle is in the middle. And I like to use that 5 chains that I did, those 5 chains to kind of hold the yarn in place around the needle. So the yarn is going behind the needle and my crochet hook goes on top of my needle. Okay, so the yarn is in back, the crochet hook is on top, and I'm just going to make a chain 1, and that has made a loop around the needle. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the yarn and swing the yarn around the needle, crochet hook on top, chain 1. Okay, now maybe here's another way to show it. With my hook perpendicular to my needle, I can swing the yarn around the back and do another chain. Swing the yarn around the back and make a chain. And that kind of rocking motion is something that I use to make a rhythm for whenever I am doing this provisional cast on. So what I'll do is I'll use my pointer finger on my right hand to rock the needle to the left, swing my yarn around, and then make another chain. And you can kind of get a pretty good rhythm with it. Now what I use my stitch markers for is, let's say I need to keep track of pattern repeats. So after I have pulled through, what I like to do is I'll go ahead and start marking my pattern repeats. So I can take a stitch marker, put that on my needle, wrap my yarn around the needle, and then cast on however many more stitches I need to according to the pattern. And that way my stitch markers are already there, and it makes it a lot easier to count. Because if you've counted the stitches between the stitch markers, you don't have to count them again, and you can just go on. Now let's say I've made it to the end of my provisional cast on and I'm ready to be done with my waste yarn. What I'm going to do is I'm going to chain 5, 2, 3. Oh dear, I'm having problems with splitting yarn today. 3, 4, 5. So I've chained 5, and then I like to pull my hook so that I give myself a generous loop, and then I will cut myself a generous tail, and I'm ready to then pick up my stitches with my yarn for my project. And then at the very end, when it's time to pick up these stitches, all I have to do is find the white yarn, pick up those stitches, and then, you know, either continue knitting the neck of a sweater or the brim of a hat, or there's all kinds of things that you can use a provisional cast on for. Just remember that when you're casting on, this yarn is not the yarn you want for your project. This is just waste yarn. You're not actually going to end up using this. It will be taken off your project in the end. Now that I have provisionally cast on all the stitches I need for my project, I'm now ready to go in with my yarn for my project that I want to work on. In my cast on, I have used stitch markers to separate my different stitch repeats. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this first stitch. Now what I have done is, this was the beginning of my crochet cast on. This was the end, and what I did is I slid my work all the way back up to my other needle, just because I'm going to be working in the round, and I have cast on in this first section, I've cast on 1 extra stitch, and I will explain why in a little bit. But what I'm going to do first is get my yarn for my project ready. I'm going to hold it in my hand like I have been. There's no trick, nothing different that I'm going to do. And I'm just going to use my fingers to pinch the yarn down. And I'm going to enter the yarn as if to knit. Wrap my yarn around and pull through. Okay, from here I might pull on the tail a little bit if I want to give myself a longer tail, but I think that's probably okay. And I'm going to go into each of these stitches the same as I would if I was knitting, just as if to knit, and go on about my way. Okay, so then we have started working with the yarn for our project. I've just finished knitting on my first row, and what I'm going to do, since I'm going to be knitting in the round, I'm going to push all of my work back to the end, the needle on the other end. Now if I was working flat, all I would do was turn my work and keep going. Okay, but since I'm working in the round, I'm going to slide back to the opposite direction, and I'm going to take some time to make sure that my yarn isn't twisted, because when I connect in the round, we want to make sure that our work doesn't end up facing the wrong direction. Okay. What I'm going to do is, if you remember, I just said I cast on 1 extra stitch in this first section. And what I'm going to do is take my yarn, let me get it in correctly, placed correctly, my yarn, hold it with my hand, and I just use my fingers to hold everything I'm working with to kind of like pinch it together. But I'm going to take this first loop on my left needle, and I am going to slip it. It might be hard to see because my needles are so dark, but I'm going to slip it knitwise onto the other needle and slide it back to connect it. Then I'll knit my first row and knit 2 together on the last stitch. I'm now getting to the end of my second row of knitting, and I realize that it's hard to see because my yarn is black and my needles are a deep brown. But I'm to my last 5 stitches of my pattern repeat, so I'm going to go ahead and purl those as my pattern suggests. So I'm purling the first 4, and then I have actually 2 stitches left. Remember, I had slipped that first stitch. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to insert the needle into both loops, and I'm going to purl those 2 together. Now you would obviously do whatever stitch your pattern called for. If it was knit, you would knit 2 together. If you purl, it's purl 2 together. And what this does is it gives our join kind of a nice even end that doesn't have a bump. And from then I can go on with my pattern.